Do you want to weigh in on this?
Certainly. I'd like to make something perfectly clear, which is that I believe that the greatest crime in the history of the world is in the process of being committed by the largest financial institutions in the world. And what they have done is amazing. They have gone out and they have bought hundreds of billions of dollars worth of toxic junk. And then, after they realized it was toxic junk, instead of taking their losses like any gas station owner would have to, they said, oh, we're important, so we think you, the taxpayers, should cover our losses. And so now we have the Federal Reserve creating out of thin air $40 billion a month to just buy this toxic junk from these banks. And it was obvious it was toxic. You know, they have the tape recordings of these bankers saying, oh, let's put some lipstick on this pig and get it out the door when they were selling it. And then they'd be betting against them on the other side in the derivatives market. And we have people who, they just can't see any crime in that. We have an Attorney General in the United States right now, Eric Holder, who can't see anything wrong with any of this crime that goes on, and it's obscene. And if our opponent were here, the Democrat, I would very much like to ask her, how come during the last Democratic administration, the Democratic Attorney General, when faced with the massive foreclosure crimes that were going on in 50 states, these banks, I'm sympathetic to the idea that people who borrow money have to pay it back. But the banks, when they go to get that money back, they should not be lying and forging signatures and gaming the state regulatory system. And that came before the Attorney General in the last administration, and he signed right on to a 50-state deal to essentially let them off the hook for almost nothing. And that's the type of thing that would not happen if I were Attorney General.
So if you were Attorney General, how would you weigh in on socialized medicine, the Obamacare, or what I call Kids Harbor Care that we now have in the state of Oregon?
I would fight against socialized medicine to the maximum extent that I could. But again, as the Attorney General, as I say, you get hit with these laws and then your job is to interpret them. Now, I take a very sort of what's now an old-fashioned view of the Constitution, although I think it's the only sensible view, which is that the idea of the Constitution was to constrain the power of the government. And I don't think under the Constitution the federal government has any business telling us what kind of services we have to buy or not buy. It's not one of the constitutional powers, period. And people who think it is are just, they're educated idiots. They have no understanding of the history of the thing or why we would want to limit government power. So to the extent that I can, I will fight against this. But when you have a legislature that goes out and passes its own version of mini Obamacare and is all anxious to sign up for this stuff, the most you can do is try and implement it in a way that does the least damage possible, which is very difficult to do when you have something as damaging as government and healthcare. People don't understand that the government has caused the entire healthcare crisis by saying you can't build any more hospitals, you can't build any more medical schools. If you want to turn one kind of bed into another bed, you have to go through $40,000 worth of administrative procedures. It's everything has been regulated to the point where less and less and less supply. And it's all about having more doctors and more hospitals, and yet you'll never hear that in any government discussion about healthcare. It's all about how can we have an army of people other than doctors and nurses making decisions about your health and rationing it and death panels and all this nonsense. It's a very disturbing development in our country. We haven't had a free market in healthcare in this country since about 1925 or something. When the American Medical Association sort of was formed and began wiping out all the alternative forms of healing that were in the country and quite widespread. It's hard to see how screwed up things are. So many things you say are correct about the evils of having these large corporations, but people don't understand that those things were in a sense created by the government. We look at paying $1,000 a month for health insurance, and then we should think about, well, what would it be like if we were totally free to make whatever arrangements we want? What if you were a doctor and you could say, I'm a doctor, I want to make my $500,000 a year. All I need is 500 patients. No, I need 500 over 12. I don't need that many patients to make $500,000 a year if they're paying me $1,000 a month, and I can use some of that to go to the hospital. But the whole system is all these corporate things that you talk about are enabled and required by the regulations themselves. In a free market, the doctors would have patients and people would subscribe to them, and there might be some of this entity and some of that entity, but the government got in there and said and began creating this massive tax bias toward having everybody do health care through these large entities because it could be this benefit that wasn't charged any income tax on it, and The whole system has been tweaked in 100 ways that it's very hard to describe, but there is an alternative, and we've never tried the free market system in healthcare, not for almost a century now.
I'd like to address this to each of you. With over 50% of the landmass of Oregon belonging to the federal government and controlled presumably by the Bureau of Land Management, how do we gain control of that? How do we open up logging? I mean, one of my big issues is job creation. And while we may be able to open up the state-owned forest, what about the federal-owned forest? How do we gain control and can open those up to logging?
We have one advantage coming in that the federal government is going broke. And as the federal government goes broke, it will begin to sell off its assets. And I would hope that Oregon would be in the position to pick up some of those assets rather than, for example, the Chinese. Short of buying the land back, the idea that I have is that we have a police power in the state of Oregon, and we have a police power to protect the health and welfare of the citizens. And we have seen this summer choking smoke over the whole state, and we've seen people's, ranches being burned up and houses being threatened. And we see that the management philosophy of the Forest Service in particular is a non-management philosophy. It's sort of just let this thing rot, let the trees fall over and rot until there's these huge fuel loads that are, in a fundamental sense, dangerous. I believe that the state has the power to insist that that danger be removed and to go in and cut those things itself if it wants to, because the Constitution, although it lets the federal government hold land, does not create any special powers in the federal government to violate local laws protecting health and safety. So I'd like to see a lot of that going on, and then maybe we can start to get some of the wood flowing again, and we can deal with this very serious drag we have on economic development in Oregon.
What is your perspective on the global warming issue, James?
My perspective is that they used to call it the greenhouse theory. And the funny thing about that was if a greenhouse doesn't have any roof, it doesn't get hot, okay? And so there is always a fundamental defect in the idea that the analogy is to a greenhouse. In the real world, the world of physics, you have carbon dioxide molecules. And if you imagine them being the size of ping pong balls, and expanding this up so you can think about it, then they're about 7,000 feet apart. And these photons come down and hit them, and sometimes they go further down, and sometimes they go sideways, and so forth and so on. And these effects are fantastically tiny. And so there is this tiny theoretical effect, and then we have people who build computer models, and they invent these assumptions to amplify the effect. And then after they put layer and layer of reinforcing feedback, then they step in front of the television cameras and say, oh my gosh, we're going to have this runaway this and this runaway that. And nearly all of those computer models have been conclusively shown to be essentially bunk. So you have a theoretical effect that is essentially true, but is probably too small to make any difference for anything. And perhaps some of the best evidence of that, and here in Oregon, we have oak trees and we have fir trees. And if you go into the ponds and you do core samples in these ponds, you'll find in history there's been times when it's all oak, and times when it's all fir, and times when it's all oak, and times when it's all fir, and it gets warmer and it gets colder in big swings that are just hundreds of times larger than anything we're talking about here. So I don't think it's a public policy priority in any way, shape, or form. And as for the lumber question we're talking about, trees die. They grow old and then they die. And a forest, a managed forest, is like any kind of garden anywhere. You can thin it, you can take trees out, and you can have maximum productivity, and you can have those forests sustainably forever. And people who are against that, I think, just don't understand how forests work.